thanks for the invitation and for the introduction. If you don't mind, I'd like to give a quick commercial for the Southern Fire Exchange. Okay, of which I'm a member and a representative. So we just wanted to get this website address up here. We're funded by the Joint Fire Science Program to deliver fire science information to the southeastern United States managers for the most part. And so we've got a lot of fact sheets online on all sorts of different topics that are relevant to management. We've got SFE webinars coming up, including these on our way that you can scan if you want to see more about them. And we've got over 80 webinars that are recorded on the website that you can enjoy and go back and read over again as well. I think they're really high quality. We've got a new Southern Fire Exchange podcast, Friends of Fire, that just kind of address a bunch of different fire topics. But again, check out the Southern Fire Exchange and all the great information there. So I'll go ahead and transition to my talk here. Here are just some of the topics I hope to cover today. Just the natural and cultural history of the Shortleaf Pine-Oak-Hickory community, its distribution relative to other pine communities, some of the traits that make it special, and then a little bit about the plant community and not just the pines themselves, some of the genetic concerns we have, and then some tips for management and restoration and kind of where to go from here. So shortleaf pine, I think most of you are probably familiar with it, living where we do in this world. It's got two fascicles to its needles, about 3 to 4 inches. It's a fire-tolerant upland species that had a pretty wide distribution historically. This is a map from Mattoon 1915 showing the distribution of shortleaf pine on the left here. And in the darker color, he's got what he considers to be the commercial range. I guess there's just enough of it, dense enough to be commercially important. And at that time, all the old growth shortleaf hadn't been cut yet. And on the east here, on the right here, just for comparison, we've got the longleaf pine distribution showing how much overlap there is between the two. In his book that he wrote about it, he said in the longleaf region, shortleaf occurs generally in groups or small stands in favorable situations, but in large areas west of the Mississippi, including like the Ouachita Highlands, where the two occupy the same soil type, and in a mixture they make up heavy stands of maximum development. So it's a little mysterious still, what separates longleaf and shortleaf west of the Mississippi River. But I think this describes how we see it here in the Red Hills region where I am, close to Tallahassee, Florida, in terms of shortleaf being in these kind of small areas within the longleaf region. But there are significant areas historically that were dominated by shortleaf pine. They've gotten pretty rare these days because of encroachment of other species and of course farming and clear cutting and replacement with other species, especially loblolly pine. But it is a majestic species. It was at one time. Just a quick comparison of the different pine habitats to give an idea of why shortleaf lives where it does and why other species tend to be where they are. And again, this is something we haven't quite figured out, but generally speaking, the shortleaf pine likes loamy soils that are dry in the uplands. It doesn't really like wet feet. Fire interval in order to regenerate the species and maintain it was probably about 2 to 5 year intervals based on dendrochronological evidence and just its habitat requirements and allowing it to get up into the overstory, which we'll talk a little bit more later. Its elevation range is up pretty high. Longleaf in comparison can live in very sandy soils, grow in sandy soils, which oftentimes excludes shortleaf, and from a wide range of wet to very dry conditions, and requires that frequent fire return interval for longleaf pine to regenerate and do well. So those might be separating factors, the fire interval and in some cases the soil. Loblolly pine historically was more in kind of wet conditions, but also likes loamy soils. And requires a longer fire return interval, certainly for regeneration, because it's pretty fire sensitive in the early stages, although it can stand fire as it gets bigger. And slash pine I just threw in there just to say that it tends to be restricted to sandier soils, unlike shortleaf. Has a wide range of moisture conditions like longleaf and needs a little bit of a break from fire to get established, unlike longleaf. So just to compare the shortleaf pine distribution with the percentage of area in the ultisol soil order, you can see that shortleaf pine corresponds very closely to the distribution of ultisols. And ultisols are soils they're very old. They're older than the Pleistocene age, and they have a sandy cap, but they have that BT clay horizon underneath it. Not pure clay necessarily, but enough to impede water enough to make it a more mesic soil, which seems to be just right for shortleaf. Spelled distribution wrong. Here's another map from Lawson 1990 showing the dots more or less representing the historic density of shortleaf pine. And you can see the Ouachita Highlands up there in the west where they're really dense. But it also shows up in our neck of the woods, which is the Red Hills region of northern Florida in southern Georgia, where Tall Timbers is located. And although it's a little bit of a disjunct population and a little bit on the edge of its main distribution, I think that Tall Timbers has played an important role in preserving this community type in some areas, because it's one of the few areas in the country where it never stopped burning, from historic lightning initiated fires and indigenous people to people burning for cattle ranching, to the quail hunting group buying up large estates, and to the present. And so we have really nicely preserved examples of shortleaf pine-oak-hickory that we can kind of use as a laboratory to understand this community better. Now, most of the places that shortleaf exists today are actually on old fields. So shortleaf pine is pretty good at getting into abandoned agriculture, or agricultural areas, of which there is a lot, especially in the 1920s and 30s. So in the Red Hills region where we are here, most of the shortleaf pine is on the shortleaf pine, loblolly pine old fields. The loblolly pine is also good at getting into the old fields. Longleaf pine, not so much. And so we have a bit of an issue around here that we'll talk about a little bit more later, that people think of shortleaf pine as old field pine, as opposed to being a native upland species. So that's something that we have to kind of disentangle and make sure that we get right to understand the species correctly. So as it is, we tend to have in the Southeast these three different flavors of upland frequently burned pines. They're not exhaustive, of course, but we got the longleaf pine wiregrass, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. It's probably the best known natural habitat in the Southeast. The shortleaf pine-oak-hickory little blue stem communities, which I think are less appreciated, maybe partly because they're even more rare than longleaf pine wiregrass habitats. And then old field shortleaf loblolly pine areas that are on abandoned agricultural fields that have come back in both of those species. So this is a close-up of the Red Hills region. Like I was talking about, these gray polygons are hunting estates that dominate this area, which again is part of the reason that we have such well-preserved communities in the area. So they bought them up in the late 1800s and basically picked up right after the burning for cattle ranching and started burning for northern bobwhite quail. These blue dots are just a few examples of high-quality shortleaf pine-oak-hickory communities that still exist, and the green polygons are longleaf wiregrass communities that still exist in the area. Most of the rest of the matrix in terms of the uplands is that old field shortleaf pine, loblolly pine community. This is a map showing witness trees that were recorded in the 1820s as part of the setting out the land lots for people moving in after the Native Americans left the area. And so I just kind of simplified this so that the gold dots are dominated by pines and the green dots are dominated by hardwoods. You can kind of see how the shortleaf pine-oak-hickory community locations are somewhat associated with these hardwoody areas. And it might have something to do with topography. They tend to be a little bit closer to rivers. On the east side of the Ochlockonee River here, it might be a fire shadow that somewhat lengthen the fire turn interval. There are also more dissected areas that make it harder for fire to spread through. So that might be part of the equation. And it also might relate to the soil types that are on those slopes where this community type tends to occur. Whereas longleaf pine tends to occur on the broad ridges where fire could easily spread, and also where you've got deeper sandy caps that are better drained and tend to discourage shortleaf pine. We did some soil measurements in several of these different sites just to get an idea if there are differences in soil characteristics. And in fact, the shortleaf pine-oak-hickory communities tend to have a little bit higher soil carbon content. They have higher nitrogen content, and pretty much across the board, higher nutrient content for calcium, potassium, as compared to longleaf pine and these old field shortleaf loblolly habitats. And I should say, we don't really know what the old field habitats were. Probably some of them were shortleaf pine-oak-hickory, some of them were longleaf pine. It's kind of hard to tell after the fact. Also, higher magnesium content, higher manganese. Phosphorus, same story. Phosphorus tends to be pretty high in the old field habitats, probably because of fertilization liming to increase the pH. And then the pH is higher as well in shortleaf pine. Now, soil nutrients are a little bit of a chicken and the egg, because it's hard to know if the vegetation there is causing the soil chemistry to change or the other way around, but there is this kind of association. The shortleaf pine or the Pine-Oak-Hickory community tends to occur on a little bit finer soils too, a little bit more silt, a little less sand, a little more clay, and it kind of corresponds with there being a little bit more mesic compared to longleaf. So this is a portion of Tall Timbers Research Station, kind of the northwest corner, in a 1931 aerial photograph showing that at least it hadn't recently been farmed like a lot of the areas. It ended up being this old field shortleaf pine, loblolly pine community. And it's in this area that we find a lot of what we think are native or areas that have never been plowed or severely altered shortleaf Pine-Oak-Hickory communities. This is a vegetation map that we recently made that was based on the timber crews, where this yellow area is shortleaf Pine-Oak-Hickory, meaning that it has a heavy component of those upland pyrophytic hardwoods such as mockernut hickory and southern red oak, post oak, blackjack oak, black oak, and some other species that seem to be very fire hardy. The light green that have the number 2s in them is shortleaf pine that doesn't have the hardwood component, I think just because the hardwood component was just cleared out, in part for quail management. There's a lot of prejudice against hardwoods when it comes to maximizing quail, even though most of the area shown in this map, I think, has not been plowed in the past. And then you see this kind of orangey color where longleaf pine's been planted, and probably where it shouldn't be, because I think historically this area was dominated by shortleaf. Now, you also see in the dark green areas are loblolly shortleaf pine. You can see how it kind of skirts the river too. I think that in this case, this habitat is not because it's old field, but because it's wetter. And so loblolly pine on tall timbers in these areas that haven't been plowed are in their more historic range. That is to say, wetter, closer to the drains, and where the fire frequency would be a little bit lower, fire return intervals would be longer, which would allow it to regenerate. So I think it's kind of a snapshot of where these species probably were historically, except for the longleaf pine, which is planted in a bunch of areas. And so here's just a picture of loblolly pines in a moist drain in the uplands, occurring still in some places today on tall timbers where they did in the past, down in the wet areas where they belong, and not so much in the uplands. Of course, in the uplands, you've got frequent fire that maintains this shortleaf habitat. We burn it every other year. I mentioned that maybe the historic fire return interval was longer, 3 to 5 years, just based on the requirement for shortleaf to regenerate. Although we do have a fair amount of shortleaf regeneration even at a 2-year fire return interval. So there's a lot to be worked out there. Mike Stambaugh did some dendrochronological research in the Cumberland Plateau, and he thought the fire return interval was probably 5 years, a little bit longer up there on average based on that. Of course, those studies don't catch all the fires. Shortleaf pine is a resprouter, which a lot of you probably know, and that distinguishes it from the other southern pines and is one of the characteristics that makes it very fire hardy. This is a picture I just took yesterday, as a matter of fact, in one of our Stoddard plots, which are long-term research plots that have been going since 1958. And this plot's been annually burned ever since then, and there's still shortleaf pine in it, just resprouting. And you can see from the picture on the right how much recruitment there is into the larger than resprouting size, which is basically none. But it does show how persistent it is as a resprouter. We don't know how long it could survive, but it allows it to stick into a situation until it has a little bit longer fire return interval and is able to get into a size that's big enough to sustain the fire without actually being top killed. And then away it goes. This is a picture from that Mattoon 1915 paper on shortleaf showing the famous basal crook of shortleaf seedlings, that little horizontal zone in the seedling that is kind of packed with meristems, so that when the above ground portion of the plant gets top killed, it readily resprouts and resprouts and resprouts. And that's an important characteristic for this species being able to tolerate fire. Like I kind of mentioned, the shortleaf pine regeneration does occur even under a 2-year fire return interval. It tends to be kind of patchy. It occurs in these little isolated areas. We just recently created a map within one of these shortleaf pine-oak-hickory communities, measuring all the trees larger than 2 centimeters DBH, diameter breast height, just kind of showing that sort of clustered nature of the regeneration. And they tend to be in gaps. And this corresponds pretty closely to what we found in longleaf habitats as well. This is on the Wade Tract longleaf pine old growth community. In the yellow area, in this case, shows the areas that did not burn following a prescribed burn, and then the regeneration and how it kind of corresponds to those unburned areas. So that might be the case in shortleaf pine as well. We hope to kind of work out that sort of thing with the sorts of long-term research that we're initiating in the shortleaf pine-oak-hickory community now. Of course, shortleaf pine is very resistant as an adult to even pretty intense fires, as is loblolly once it gets to a certain size, and of course longleaf and slash pines. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this problem of intraggression or the interbreeding of loblolly pine and shortleaf pine. This has been a big conservation concern. This is a paper by Tower et al. With the Stewart and Will and Lilly and Gilden and Nelson group that's been doing a lot of work on shortleaf and this genetics problem in particular, and I've done a little bit of work with them as well. These bar graphs here show that the blue bars are areas that are dominated or historically dominated by longleaf, and showing what percentage of them are actual hybrids to some degree with shortleaf pine. And so you can see from the 1950s till today that the loblolly pine communities have become much more genetically impure, and then even more so for the shortleaf sites, again showing in some cases alarmingly high percentage of shortleaf pine that are actually hybrids between shortleaf pine and loblolly. And we think the reason is that because of fire exclusion, loblolly pine has been able to march up the slopes, and of course it's planted everywhere, as well as a commercial species. And so it's interacted closely with shortleaf pine in a way that it didn't historically because of the separation of the two species by frequent fire. And so you have these very high rates, often 50% of the shortleaf pine in an area on average actually being hybrids between shortleaf pine and loblolly pine. And the concern there is that, once you get to a certain point, it's going to be hard to get these populations back pure again, which means that if you do reintroduce frequent fire and all the natural historic habitat characteristics, then maybe these hybrids won't respond in the sort of natural way, and they'll be harder to manage with natural conditions, in addition to possible concerns about timber quality and et cetera, things we may not even know about yet. A paper that I collaborated with this group on at Tall Timbers looked at this question. Tall Timbers was kind of a good laboratory for looking at this because we have all these old fields where you have mixtures of shortleaf pine and loblolly pine in the overstory, and so presumably a lot of interbreeding. But the hypothesis was that in the fire excluded areas, like this research plot we have here that's had fire excluded since 1966, there would be higher number of hybrids than there are in the frequently burned areas, because fire might be culling out those hybrids and certainly loblolly pine and resulting in a more pure population of shortleaf pine. And so this table here, I'm depending on your remembering your high school genetics here, but on the left column at the top you've got just LL for pure loblolly, and at the bottom you have SL for pure shortleaf. And then these different back crosses are representative of different degrees of genetic tendency towards loblolly or shortleaf. So LLBC3 is back cross 3. That means a hybrid back cross with loblolly, then back cross with loblolly, then back cross with loblolly. So it's pretty close to being loblolly, but it's got a little bit of shortleaf in it, so on and so forth. What we can see here is that in the unburned plots, the hybrids, as well as the pure loblolly and shortleaf, are kind of spread across this gradient of genetic closeness to loblolly or shortleaf pine, whereas in the burned plots they lean very heavily towards the shortleaf. And you can see the pure shortleaf in the burned plots, and these are right next to each other. We're like 76%, 92%, 75%, 46% in 3B. That was kind of a wet area, so it was probably more subject to loblolly genes. But on the whole, we can see that this fire is having a purifying effect, and although not getting rid of all the hybrids, definitely shifting it towards the shortleaf genetics. So I want to talk really quickly about the shortleaf pine-oak-hickory native plant community, which we've also looked at and have had a lot of interest in. like I mentioned, in the Red Hills region, there's been a lot of belief that if there's shortleaf pine, then it must be an old field. And we're trying to make the argument to the contrary that certainly there are a lot of old fields, but there are also these native plant community types. So we put in 100-meter squared plots in a bunch of different locations in the Red Hills, representing either what we think are native shortleaf sites or longleaf pine wiregrass sites or old field sites, which we know were old field because of the aerial photographs. Most of them pretty old fields, like 89 years old. And I did these plant censuses. And this is just a summary PCA showing where each of these dots represents one of the plots we put in, and the proximity of the plots represents how similar they are in plant species composition. And you can see that the shortleaf pine community, it looks like its own distinct thing that's separate from the old fields and also separate from longleaf. Now, there's a lot of overlap in the species. There are a lot of generalists in these communities, but there are also a lot of indicator species to the shortleaf pine community. And it also kind of corresponds, this is the CCA analysis that includes the soil data. It kind of corresponds to soil characteristics as well, where the shortleaf habitats have higher carbon and nitrogen percent silt, whereas the longleaf habitats have a deeper A horizon thickness, which is pretty much pure sand, in a deeper depth to that BT clay horizon and the ultrasols. In the old field habitats are even clayier because of, most of that sandy caps eroded during the agricultural era. And like I mentioned, there are a bunch of shortleaf Pine-Oak-Hickory indicator species that, when you see those species, it's a good confirmation that this is not an old field. It's really its own natural community, including black oak, which you never see in upland longleaf pine communities. And this is just a list of genera from our studies, and just making the point that this same list of genera is very characteristic of longleaf Pine-Oak-Hickory throughout its range, even like in the Cumberland Plateau, the New Jersey Pine Barrens, Washita Highlands, different species a lot of times, but the same basic phylogenetic structure of these community types that I think are kind of related to these old growth grassland, savanna, and woodland kind of concept. These species that are perennial, they resprout after fire. They're really good at dealing with frequent fire, but not really good at coming back once you disturb the soil, because they have a lot of limited seed dispersal ability. A lot of their root storage is a lot of their storage of energy is in the organs. So once you till them up, they don't come back very easily. And they're very stable communities. They're really either non-successional or late successional, not early successional type communities. The reason I make this point is just that when we find these community types, we need to be really careful about not destroying them with soil disturbance, and instead restoring them with frequent fire, which is what they really need. So just quick conclusions. The native shortleaf Pine-Oak-Hickory community type is ecologically unique, but it's highly threatened. There's very little of it left. Soil disturbance and lack of frequent fire have been the biggest sources of decline of the community type. Genetic introgression of loblolly pine on shortleaf pine is a big problem, but fire is the best solution. So we do have, kind of a solution to the problem, we think, although it could be too late in some places if the introgression gets so severe that the pines are just not responding well to fire anymore, and that's where we don't want to get. The native plant community is a late successional, old growth type savanna woodland community that depends on fire, depends on open tree canopy, and protection from soil disturbance. So where we find this, we want to be able to protect it. But we do need knowledge about identifying this community type, getting to know its indicator species so we can restore it appropriately. For example, it's not necessarily old field, like a lot of people think it might be. And so it shouldn't be disked up. And also it should not necessarily be replanted in longleaf pine. So ironically, we're restoring shortleaf habitats by, in some cases, disking them, herbiciding them, and planting a bunch of longleaf, and that's not what we want to do, even though it's been done to tall timbers, and it's kind of interesting how we learn as we go. And last of all, we need an effort to map remnants of this community type and prioritize it for conservation management. If we don't know it, if we don't recognize it, don't see it, then obviously we won't be able to manage it correctly and conserve it for the future. So I'll stop there, and hopefully we have time for maybe one or two questions before the break, but I sure appreciate your attention.
Thanks, Kevin. I'm checking the chat box right now, and I don't have any questions.
Okay.
We have a few minutes for questions if anybody has one. All right, Kevin. Well, I appreciate it, sir. And you going to stick around for a while with us?
Yeah.
Okay. So if y'all have any questions, you can shoot them.
Ryan, you had
Oh.
one pop up real quick.
Oh, okay. Sorry. In your data, are those clusters of young shortleaf showing up more in areas where they're under mature overstory hickory / oak leaf trees?
They tend to be in gaps just by casual observation, but there is some regeneration underneath the hardwoods in some cases. They tend not to regenerate underneath the pines, though. And presumably that's where the highest fuel is, where you've got, pine needles that have high energy content. They burn. Anybody who's done some burning knows that the burning is best underneath the pines. But those are the kinds of things we want to get to know better. We just set up this long-term study, so we just have kind of a snapshot of it and not really the dynamics, but they do tend to occur in the gaps and to some degree underneath the hardwoods.